So I want us to consider again in this talk a greater emphasis on how we respond. I need to deal with a bit of the science, which I will do at one point. I will just be burdening you a little bit with some of the science, but I want it to be plain that this is really to do with how the Christian should respond to these issues. It's not that everything's negative. In fact, there are quite a number of things which are positive, which the Christian can actually say, because they believe in the Bible, they've actually got the edge on the others. They know the way history has developed because we read about it in the Bible. They also know the general picture as to the way things are going to go into the future. I've already mentioned that a biblical history is essential. I'm going to emphasize that point again. I'm going to emphasize stewardship. Then I'm going to talk about how we deal with issues like waste. And then I'm going to begin to draw it to a close as I speak about what really matters. So looking at the past is essential. I've basically been saying that unless we have this lens through which we understand the past, we will make big mistakes in understanding even the science of what we know. The facts we will not interpret correctly. We won't look at the rocks correctly. That's what I've just been referring to in some of those DVDs that I've mentioned. We certainly won't understand the ice cores properly. The Bible makes it abundantly plain that it's a history which is of the order of about 6,000 years, that takes us from where we are now back to Adam, which means that you and I are all descended in a matter of just hundreds of generations, not thousands. Doesn't get anywhere near that. Hundreds of generations back to Adam. So when it says in 1 Corinthians 15, for as in Adam all die, a person who has got an old earth view and thinks that Adam either didn't exist, which some, sadly, Christians, some people who believe the Bible, know the Lord Jesus, are actually saying, subscribing to, or else some are saying, well, he existed, but it was way back, in the hundreds of thousands of years ago. Well, if you've got that view, somehow the events in the garden are distant and they're no longer really historically connected to you. So when it says as in Adam all die, you're thinking, well, he was way back, he was just a primitive guy. No, he wasn't. He was actually of the order of maybe 200 generations at the very most, backwards. In the whole of the population has come from Adam and Eve. And of course, the bottleneck of Noah brings you to somewhere in the region maybe of 150 generations. And so it goes on. Roughly speaking, the birth of Noah back to the creation of Adam is about 1,000 years. Then Noah to Abraham is about another 1,000 years. Abraham to David is roughly another 1,000 years. And then we come to Christ. So David to Christ, another 1,000 years. So you actually got 4 lots of roughly 1,000 years. And that's how the Bible pictures it. Now, you might disagree about exact hundreds, and it will depend to a certain extent on some issues which are minor. But the overall picture is very clear that it's of the order of thousands of years ago. And of course, Christ 2,000 years ago, that's where we are. So the genealogies at the beginning are actually very important. They are repeated in repeated in Luke, repeated also in 1 Chronicles chapter 1. And the fact that God says these names 3 times is very important. Then the verse in Jude that I was just briefly jumped ahead of myself refers to Enoch, the 7th from Adam, which underlines the importance of those early genealogies. Essentially, there is no gaps there. And if you want more information, you can get my book, Genesis for Today, from which this chart comes. And Simon Turpin, who's the leader of Answers in Genesis, has just written a book on 2 Peter chapter 3 and the scoffers. It's a brilliant book, and I'd love it to be out. It's not out till October, but ask him for a copy, and he might be prepared to send it to you once it comes out. But, 2 Peter speaks about the link between the flood and what is happening today. And so I think there is a lot of issues here which we need to have in our minds concerning how the scripture connects the past to where we are at today. So when I'm coming to the issue of how I speak to the environmental situation today, but let's not forget that the scripture is very clear, even in the New Testament, that what's happened in the past is actually something that the Lord is aware of concerning what happens in the future. Just as the world in 2 Peter 3 says it was destroyed by water and it was a worldwide flood, the world is going to be destroyed by fire, which, by the way, is a very big argument for showing you that the world was destroyed globally by the flood, just as the world in the future will be purged or everything on it destroyed by fire. So we are looking, as it says in 2 Peter 3, to a new heavens and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. That is what we should have in our minds. And there's so many Christians who don't believe in the global flood. And to me, it's absolutely plain. Why on earth would he make a rainbow if it was just a local flood? There wouldn't be a point of doing it. But it has to be a global flood, because he says, I'll never do this again. Well, he's done plenty of local floods, allowed them a number of times, thousands of times. If it was a local flood, then it wouldn't make sense of the rainbow promise. So the world that then was being overflowed with water perished, and the old world was entirely destroyed. So we need to have this picture in our minds. If you begin to break that picture, and if you have eons of prehistory, then you've broken God's clock, and you've broken the timeline which connects us back to Adam. A true biblical history is essential. If you deny the flood, or if you deny the global flood, then it means that one misunderstands the rocks and the climatic catastrophe they show. You deny the fact that, although it doesn't say explicitly, and I do grant you that, nowhere does it say that explicitly that there was one ice age, but it's very interesting that the book of Job, which is probably the oldest book in terms of when it was written, it refers a lot to ice and snow, which is an interesting fact. The ice age followed the flood, and all the science strongly suggests that. And I mentioned in the first talk the compacted layers of the ice sheets in Greenland and Siberia, and all that begins to make sense from a very different perspective. And it also means, of course, that the geology changes, and in the way that we could look at the geology. Not that I am an expert geologist, but I can think into these things just like any intelligent layperson can. And it's fascinating that right at the top of the highest mountain in the world, Mount Everest, just before the top, near the Hillary Step, which is a famous part which you have to go through in order to get right up to the top, very close to that is layers of sediments containing sea creatures. Absolutely astonishing, but they're there. And if you come to the foothills of the Himalayas, ammonites galore at about 12,000 feet. Everything is strongly suggesting the catastrophic origin of all those fossils, and then the pushing up of the mountains as it describes, interestingly enough, and the deepening of the oceans in Psalm 104, which I just read part of this morning. Noah's flood and the catastrophic plate tectonics is strongly indicated by things like the massive layering of fossils of dinosaurs, which run all the way right across this western part of the United States and Mexico. You need to look at the Genesis Apologetics video published by Dan Biddle, which you can find on YouTube. It really is well worth seeing, where it joins the dots of all that. People then begin to see that the dumping of all that sediment, the dumping of all those fossils, is to do with catastrophe. It's to do with the biblical flood. This picture, this next one, is in my book, which I've written on the rocks at the last chapter or so of the book, The Wonders of Creation. I wrote that chapter, and this shows beautifully the catastrophic nature of, in this case, a turtle fossilized with a Psittacosaurus, which is a little dinosaur. And they're both together in the rocks. And it makes sense of it. The fact that we've got recognizable octopuses, or should we say octopi, which have got all their tentacles visible, where normally they would just get washed away and disintegrate if it was over a long period of time. Strongly indicating catastrophic burial. Now, the bit that I didn't deal with this morning, which I do want to deal with now, is the Ice Age. One of the biggest problems that the secular climate theorists have is explaining how you even get an Ice Age. Now, this is a very interesting point, because they talk about multiple Ice Ages, which is the key to their supposedly understanding the climate of the past. I maintain that if you cannot properly explain the climate that you know has taken place in the past, because it's evident that there was glaciation, nobody's disagreeing with that. The fact you've got U-shaped valleys right across our country, in Wales, in Scotland, carved out by massive amounts of ice, taking boulders with them, it's very evident that that's happened. Well, what you need is a combination of, in fact, contrary to what you might think, mild winters and cool summers. It's not what you would have thought. It's not by very cold winters. The moisture content of cold air is much less than that of warmer air. And less moisture in the air means less precipitation and hence less snowfall. Well, the secular answer was Milankovitch cycles, which I mentioned this morning, but I didn't explain what they were. The secularists say that it is due to these long cycles, which are wobbles in the Earth's orbit as it goes round the sun. And of course, these cycles, they determine, are tens of thousands of years. So it's due to the precession of the Earth wobbling as it goes round the sun. Obviously that takes a year, but we're talking about the orbit of the sun, or orbit of the Earth rather, as it goes round the sun. This orbit actually wobbles. That's what they're trying to suggest. And I'm not denying the Milankovitch cycles exist, and we're just in a small part of that cycle. But of course, they maintain that the solar system has been here for hundreds of thousands of years. And so they would argue that the ice has been laid and then melted over periods of tens of thousands of years for each cycle, or even up to 50,000 years or thereabouts. So the secularists are trying to say that the ice cores are a result of ice ages which came and went repeatedly due to these Milankovitch-induced change in solar heating. But they know that the change in the solar heating is too small to melt the glaciers or to send Earth into a deep freeze, and yet they need it. So how do you make an ice age? Well, the answer is not Milankovitch cycles. It fits brilliantly into the biblical flood model, because the biblical flood 4,500 years ago or thereabouts gives you a huge amount of evaporation into the atmosphere. That's the first thing you need, right? You've got many, many clouds due to the fact that you've got clouds of dust pushed into the atmosphere, which themselves encourage still a pretty large amount of rainfall, and of course a lot of snowfall in the poles, north and south, but particularly in the north. So that would have led to, after the flood, the sun not getting through very well in the summer when the tilt of the earth was towards the sun in the northern hemisphere. And that would have led, therefore, to cool summers and moderate winters, which is exactly what you need for one ice age. So with a lot of the clouds of dust into the atmosphere, that would have led to much snow and a glaciation, probably over a period of about 300 to 400 years. So the position that most people who take a creation/flood model of the past take is that there was the worldwide flood, and then leading up to the time of Abraham, which would be roughly the time that the book of Job was written, because it's evidently before Moses, before the temple, it's way back. It's in those times of the early patriarchs, that this was the time of the Ice Age, and probably Job was in the back end of that as we were coming out. So the flood induced severe snowfall over centuries, with hot oceans, and a lot of, as is indicated there, a lot of volcanoes still going on, settling down after the flood. All this dust was in the atmosphere, and it gradually began to dissipate, and only later did the world recover from the flood, and the world settled down into a very different environment to what we have today. That's the graph of water vapor capacity that I mentioned, and you'll see there that if you actually reduce the temperature, then you actually don't increase the amount of precipitation. You actually need it's not a matter of making the winters cooler, it's a matter of making the summers cooler. And the effect of water vapor is described here in this article by Rod Martin, which is well worth downloading from the Answers Research Journal, which is produced by Answers in Genesis. Rod Martin wrote this some years ago, where he says that warm seas worldwide following the flood would provide optimum conditions for initiating the Ice Age. It would have been like lake effect storms greatly enhanced. Michael Ord, a meteorologist, estimated that 500 to 700 years would have been required for the Ice Age to reach its maximum level. During this time, more snow would have been precipitated in the winter than would have melted in the summer. Consequently, the snow cover would have increased in thickness and lateral extent. As the polar seas cooled, less evaporation would have translated into less snow, and eventually snowfall would equal melting, stabilizing the extent of glaciation. In other words, those glaciers are not hundreds of thousands of years old. They are simply the result of the one ice age which came after the flood. And Michael Ord has argued with those who say that the science doesn't support his position. And he rightly says in his article here, which is called Ice Cores versus the Flood, in the other journal, the technical journal, in 2004, my starting assumptions assume significant climate instability post-flood, and rapid accumulation of snow and ice. In this scenario, annual ice layers would be on the order of meters. So now that you have that perspective in your mind, I'm sorry to perhaps burden you with a bit more science, but you need to be clear that the way you look at the flood is very important in understanding where we are at today, because it's not as far away as people think. Even the San Andreas Fault is still recovering from the flood, right? Earthquakes that we have in various parts of the world is still the result of the world settling down, having been broken apart at the flood, right? That flood was catastrophic. It broke open the Earth's crust. That's what we're suggesting. It was much more catastrophic than people realize. It destroyed everything, right? It completely removed what the land was before. That's why there's no place which is Eden today. You don't see an angel with a flaming fire guarding Eden, because Eden is gone. It went under the flood. See, that's why 2 Peter 3 stresses that the way to understand the future is to understand the past. That's why I've stressed it. Now we come to the issue of the dominion mandate in a fallen world. Right? Do you see where I'm going? I have to stress this bit about the past. Now, Genesis 1 verse 28 applies just as much in a post-flood world as it does in the pre-flood world. But we must remind ourselves that in that world as it was with Adam and Eve, I guess you've got the holy if, that if Adam had never sinned, then it would have been a perfect world. A man would have replenished the earth. He would have subdued it and had dominion over the fish and the sea and the fowls of the air and over every living thing that moved upon the earth. And there would have been no fear of the animals, which is mentioned, by the way, from the animals, I should say, which is mentioned after the flood when God repeats this. I'll read that because I haven't put it in on the screen. I'll come to that. Now the world after the fall is cursed. The ground is cursed. That which was originally very good is now not good. Now recently there was a talk by a well-known theistic evolutionist, Bob White, who addressed the Keswick Convention just this last year. And he was trying to argue that it was still good in the fallen world, but it can't be good in the fallen world when you've got evidence of cancers in the creatures which existed in the past. And in the fossils you can actually see that many of the creatures buried there had cancers in them. So we know that even obviously today there's lots of creatures which have diseases which trouble them and diseases that trouble us. So are we going to say that those cancers and the other genetic diseases and the many other ones that we have, which, and there are some commonalities between us and the animals, are we going to say that the animals always were suffering from that in the past and we somehow got to say it was good and then God made man without those initially? No, it's a false distinction. What this clearly shows to us is that the curse that came upon the ground and the fact that death came to us also caused death to come to the animals as well. And that's the position of the creation argument. And in my view, it's the position which fits with exactly what Genesis 1 says. Originally, everything was good, perfect. There was no death. There was no death of animals as well, which is why it says in Genesis 1 verse 30 that he gave the vegetables for food for the animals. And then he says in Genesis 1 verse 31, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Then in Genesis 3, after the fall, God says, cursed is the ground for your sake. This is to Adam. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. And death comes into the world, not only as I've indicated for Adam, but also for the whole world, which is why it says in Romans 8 that the whole creation groans, waiting for the day of redemption, which is when the Lord Jesus returns. And there will be a new heavens and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. So the Edenic curse is very, very important. But what we must see is that the dominion mandate still applies today. And we need to grasp that what God has done, he has done in order that sin would be dealt with as it was. It was restricted. The lifespan of those who were against God was no longer going to be forever. What would it be if Hitler lived for hundreds of years? What would it be if Pol Pot had lived indefinitely? God brought death in the world to restrict sin. And then the lifespan dropped until after the flood. The lifespan dropped right down to what it is today, normally of the order of 70 years and 10. So I've been reminded of that recently. I had a shock to my system this year, and I'm reminded that we are not here for long. And that's all because God would restrict sin. Now, it says in Genesis chapter 9, after the flood, let me just deal with this bit as I mentioned to you, that I will surely require your blood of your lives will I require. Genesis 9 verse 5. At the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man. And the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. And I want you to see that God allows in this passage in Genesis 9, if you read the earlier verses, that God is allowing man to eat flesh officially. It's not that it wasn't done before, it probably was. But God is officially allowing it. And he's allowing man to actually not only farm the animals, but to eat them. Now this introduces a new issue, which of course, unless you're a Christian, you won't be able to understand the nuances here, because God in Genesis 9 has allowed the death of animals, even to kill them for meat. But he hasn't allowed cruelty. And there is a difference. Humane killing is allowed, as Genesis 9 makes it plain, that they are for meat. The actual verse there I didn't read, so let me read it to you, because I didn't put this into the presentation. But in Genesis 9, it says, every moving thing, verse 3, that lives shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things. But flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall you not eat. So God has made it very plain that he is allowing animals to be used for meat, but that doesn't then mean that you can just slaughter them at will and do what you want and just be cruel to them. So the dominion mandate is actually feeding into a care for the environment and a care for the other animals. And I agree with the book which I recommended to you earlier, which just get the title of it. It was a greener. I had green in the title. Just remind you of it. But I agree with this author. A different shade of green. Gordon Wilson. It's well worth reading that book, because it makes it abundantly plain that the Christian should be in the vanguard of actually caring in the right way for the environment, and caring in such a way that we don't misuse the world that God has given to us. So righteousness is said in Proverbs 12 to be in the man who takes care of the life of his beast. But the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. It's very interesting when you actually start studying the scriptures concerning should we be looking after the world around us, and it makes it very plain that we should be. After all, when God was rebuking David concerning his adultery, Nathan told the story about the lamb, and he said how cruel it was for the man who only had one lamb, for the visitor who'd come just to take that one, when he could have gone to the other person the rich man could have taken one of his own flock. And then, of course, he famously says, David, thou art the man. And of course, it was an analogy. It was just a story. But nevertheless, the story is based on what God knew would be David's reaction. That man ought to be killed immediately for what he's done. You're the man. And then we have in Exodus 23, did you know that the animals are to have a Sabbath as well? Nobody yet talks much about that today because we're all using cars. But in those days, animals were used for transport. They were used for ploughing the fields. Give them a rest. They need a rest as well. So you're to care for the animals. And then Rebecca feeds not just the servant who had come, Abraham's servant who had come all that way. She feeds the camels as well. And in Deuteronomy 25, Moses strictly instructs the Israelites, thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treads out the corn. I know that's taken by the Apostle Paul and spiritualized concerning, quite rightly, the way that we should care for those who spiritually are working for the Lord amongst us. But the original point is also true. And remember this, that God owns and cares for all the animals. How interesting that at the end of the book of Jonah, when God had got Jonah to recognize that he's the one in authority, he has mercy on whom he will. Even Nineveh, which was such a wicked nation. Assyria was an awful nation. What they did to people, they hung up their prisoners and said, that's what's going to happen to you if you don't, go with us and come out. You will be slaughtered like these people. And of course, Jonah was terrified about going to Nineveh. And God that's the whole point of the story of Jonah. But then it says right at the end, Jonah, you got all, sulking because, I took away your gourd. He says, and should not I spare Nineveh, that great city, wherein are more than 6,000 persons that cannot discern between their right hand and their left hand? And then he says, and also much cattle. That's a lovely phrase right at the end of the book of Jonah. Why has God put it there? To instruct us that God cares for animals. We need to be careful if we're involved, as you might be, because we were just staying close to Chessington Zoo. And there were all these people looking after the animals. I'm thinking, oh, that's great. They are looking after the animals. Okay, they're making a profit as all the rest of it. But we should be caring. And we should be in the forefront of showing care for the animals. God owns them all. Every beast of the forest is mine, Psalm 50, verses 10 and 11. And the cattle upon 1,000 hills. I know all the fowls of the mountains. And the wild beasts of the field are mine. And you know that God instructed through Moses that they were to have a rest concerning the land. The land itself had to have a rest. Now, that's a very interesting point. I'm not an expert on farming. My wife knows far more about the land and growing things than I do. And I'm just one who learns by observation and reads what others do. But I know this, that if you over-farm, it can become a problem. And I wonder whether that has relevance to us today. This is the view of one article that I read. And I've taken some of these points from this article. I wasn't sure about all that they put, but this point I thought was a good one. In factory farming, crowding together thousands of animals into large facilities can cause damage to the environment. Hens, for instance, are kept in tiny spaces, and that is cruel, is it not? That's why we have the movement for free-range hens and free-range eggs. Well, you may not be able always to do this. Sometimes you've got to think of the greater evil of the importance of people's food that they need, malnutrition if they don't. So there is a massive problem in terms of feeding people. But it's very interesting that the places where the growth of population is huge, they generally don't have this type of factory farming. They'll have large families in Africa and Asia, but actually the hens are all just running around. I've been there, seen it. And we need to think into the use of chemical pesticides, fertilizers, which are in danger of polluting rivers, lakes, streams, aquifers, and other drinking water sources. These are obvious points, but they are causing human health problems. And should not the Christians be in the vanguard of such matters? I believe we should. It's not that we can win all the arguments, and it's not that we're buying into global warming. We're just simply saying that we should care as good stewards for God's world. And coming to conservation, at the flood, the Lord encourages Noah to maintain great diversity. It's in Genesis chapter 7. The Lord said to Noah, and the whole passage you need to read really, "Come down all thy house into the ark." And then he says, every clean beast you should take the 7, I think that means 7 pairs, but all the other animals, it was just 1 pair. And then he says, to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. So this is the seed of all the creatures. So in that book, a greener shade of, a different shade of green, Gordon Wilson makes the point that is it just that we preserve now just some dogs and forget the rest? No. We should actually preserve the variety of dogs, the variety of different types of wild dogs. I'm not just talking about the artificial dogs. And it was the same with all the creatures. We should be concerned about the loss of some species. Is it right to actually overfish and lose some types of fish because of that? And this is all part of the dominion mandate, which goes all the way back to Genesis 1. Remember this, though. The Lord supports all things, and by him all things consist. Everything is upheld by the word of his power. And we do need to remember something very important, and that is that in the future, in Isaiah, some people would take this spiritually, and even if it's spiritual, it certainly implies that there was something amazing which happened at the beginning where the wolf and the lamb were dwelling together. I have the conviction that this is probably a physical prophecy. Somehow it's going to come true. That the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. There is going to be, in some way, a restitution of all things. That word is actually used in the New Testament, in the book of Romans. There is coming a time when the Edenic curse will no longer be dominating everything. And we need to remember that. Well, there should be a care, would you not agree, for the environment? I think it's very clear from Scripture. Not that it should necessarily be our only plan and not necessarily the major plan, but it should be part of our care and concern. Let me just dig a bit deeper as to what's happening today. This horrifies me. I said I deal with waste, effluents, and nasty chemicals. Let me just dwell for a few moments on this. This is just awful. Have you heard of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch? Did you know that more than 1 million seabirds and 100,000 marine animals die from plastic pollution every year. Some of us were discussing the acidity in the oceans. And although some people say it's mainly due to carbon dioxide, I actually think that a lot of it is probably actually due to us polluting it. Because although the sea's huge, and it does take a long time to absorb the plastic, 100% of baby sea turtles have plastic in their stomachs. There is now 5.25 trillion macro and micro pieces of plastic in our ocean, and 46,000 pieces in every square mile of ocean, weighing up to 269,000 tons. Every day, 8 million pieces of plastic make their way into the oceans. And the Great Garbage Patch is the size bigger than Texas in the ocean. It's just phenomenal. The world produces 381 million tons in plastic waste yearly. This is set to double by the 2030s. So this garbage patch is absolutely disgusting. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch is floating literally sort of in between San Francisco and Hawaii. It's in that region. Well, that is a real problem, and you cannot justify it from any Christian angle. We cannot say that, we can't do anything about this. We should be. And this is where we do have an agreement with some who are deeply concerned about the way we are spoiling the environment. This, I would say, is a much bigger issue than really the global warming issue. The global warming issue, I think, is driven really by a political ideology. But this matter of waste is a big issue that Christians should not be unconcerned about. I believe we should be concerned about it. The Bible makes it plain that we're to care for the creatures. I find this picture very evocative. There is a turtle. They're wonderful creatures. I went to St. Lucia a couple of, when was it? Beginning of 2020, just before COVID. And, no, it wasn't St. Lucia. It was earlier than that. It was in the Greek islands. And we were on this island, and we saw these turtles which were being cared for by this group of people. And they came up, they took them up, and they washed them of all the barnacles and other stuff that get onto them, and then they put them back into the ocean. It was wonderful seeing them. What island was it, Juliet? It's gone from me. Where's Juliet? Yeah, I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, but it was wonderful seeing them. Now, if I'd seen them all with plastic bags on them, I'd have been horrified. They are wonderful creatures. And we need sustainable waste disposal. Now, this is where it does link with the carbon dioxide argument. You see, I don't think personally, as you gathered, that the global warming is driven by the CO2. I think it's to do with something that's happening to do with space and the cosmic rays, and, as you gathered, by the way it's behaving and the sunspot activity. But this is where it impinges on the way that we operate with waste, and there is a collision. The decision has been made in the wisdom of all the countries in the West that we will no longer incinerate waste. Well, that becomes a massive issue, because the only answer is landfill. But how can you put all the plastic bags and stuff into landfill? And then some nations say, well, we'll just dump it in the ocean. Well, that's led to this massive garbage patch in the Pacific. Now, there are ways of incinerating where you don't put toxic gases into the atmosphere. I was in the Fuel and Energy Department, of what was then called the Fuel and Energy Department of the University of Leeds. And our whole department was all built around clean dispersal of waste, initially using incineration. But then, of course, people came along and said, oh, you can't incinerate anymore. So what's happened is we've lost a whole industry which was built up knowing how to deal with these nasties and burn them off carefully such you didn't put lots of stuff into the atmosphere. It's not just carbon dioxide, of course, that comes out. You've got sulfurs and all sorts of other stuff. We call it scrubbing. And they had the ability to actually scrub those gases, get those gases out, or get the sulfur dioxide off, so you didn't actually put it into the atmosphere and cause acid rain and all the other troubles. So we knew how to do it, but we were stopped from burning anymore. Now we've got this problem of waste in the oceans. Do you see now that when you get the science, in my view, we haven't got it right on the global warming aspect? And it's led to these troubles. And by the way, we shouldn't be dumping our waste on others. This is a major issue. Quietly, United States particularly, but we've done it as well, are dumping our old ships onto the parts of the world which can least defend themselves from all the nasties that come from when you break up a ship. And you need to do it. You have to do the same with old aircraft. There's whole piles of aircraft today being broken up because they're no longer being used. Alang in Gujarat in northwest India is the largest graveyard of ships in Asia. Every year, hundreds of old oil tankers, container ships and other vessels continue to be found on this coast, and so on. Then it says they work barefoot with bare hands, with simple hammers and saws to piece apart the rusted carcasses, still full of bitumen, asbestos, toxic waste, and often with gas still in the tanks. Is that the way to treat other people? No. We need to stop that practice. But look, having said that, I need to close. We cannot build heaven here. That's what we must remember. We must be responsible, but the Word of God says the world passes away. He that doeth the will of God abides forever. 1 Corinthians 7, mainly talking about marriage, but Paul interjects, as he often does in his arguments. Look, I've been talking about this. Look, the time is coming. They that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not, and they that use this world as not abusing it. For the fashion of this world passeth away. The original Greek is the cosmos is passing away, and that's the whole cosmos. And I reminded you of 2 Peter 3. The world is going to be burnt up. But then it goes on to say in 2 Peter 3 that we look to new heavens and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. For here we have no continuing city, but we seek one to come. That was the past catastrophe. The real catastrophe is this one to come. The Lord spoke of it. The Lord spoke in no uncertain terms that as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, and so on, and then the flood came and destroyed them all. God's timeline is that is coming. So this I'm maintaining about global warming and even environmental matters is not the main issue. The real issue, and the issue which matters, is that people are lost or saved. And the only answer lies in the cross of the Lord Jesus Christ. He is the King. He is the one who bled and died for us. He is the one who, yes, would have us care for people primarily, and even for the animals, and even for the environment, as I've argued. But don't lose sight that the biggest issue of all is men's soul.